Well, hello there. It's time for your first flipped lecture. We're going to do a lot of these as we move through the year, and it's something that I like to do in order to catch up and to clarify certain things. Okay, so it is Friday afternoon, so I'm trying to get through this as quickly as possible. Okay, we're going to talk about reason. We're going to talk Voltaire. We're going to talk Rousseau. We're going to talk enlightened despotism. We're going to talk some other Enlightenment thinkers that we haven't looked at, and we're going to look at seven basic big takeaways from the Enlightenment, how it started and how it was how it persisted, and we're going to look at. Here we go. You can follow along in my Enlightenment notes if you would like. Those are on. Those are in resources, and I'm going to go quickly through them as quickly as I can. But let's look at first. I'll go back to here. Reason. Okay. This is something that philosophers and people, historians, debate all the time. What is reason? How do we use it? Where does it come from? What does it mean? Okay, so I just want to think about this objectively and say, okay, how can reason get us into trouble? And how has it helped us? How has it hurt us? And how can we use it appropriately? Because Jonathan Swift, famous writer, Gulliver's Travels, right, wrote an essay, a satirical essay called A Modest Proposal in 1729, that brings to light in this first, as we periodize the Enlightenment, this first period of the Enlightenment being where bridging the scientific revolution up through the Enlightenment in the first half of the 1700s, he writes a essay satirically called A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People in Ireland from Being a Burden to Their Parents or Country and for Making Them Beneficial to the Public. So he starts writing and he starts talking about, if I can find the website, I think I kept it up here, no I did not, but I can bring it up here if you just Google Jonathan Swift, A Modest Proposal. It's not there. Which one did I use? I don't remember. Swift, A Modest Proposal. Let's go back to history. Here we go. All right, here we go. Yes, artbin.com. Okay, so he goes through and he starts talking about, there's just so many children in Ireland. They're having babies. This is and thinking of the Enlightenment ideas of progress and reason and all these different things. What should we do about this? And the Enlightenment ideas of, hey, maybe we should start using our faculties of reason and science to look at society and see how we can improve it. He's saying, there are a number of souls in this kingdom being 1.5 million. They're breeding and the children are dying by accident, and really what he's doing is making a critique of how the British are keeping Ireland pretty much as a colony, right? Subduing Ireland and suppressing Ireland through taxes and landlords and everything else. But I wanted to highlight this part. So he basically is using satirically his reason to say, I have been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young, healthy child, well nursed, is at a year old a most delicious, most nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled, and I make no doubt that it will equally serve in a fricassee or a ragout. I do therefore humbly offer it to public consideration because, hey, these ideas were being published all the time in this Enlightenment fervor of publishing new things and ideas and getting the spirit of improving society out there. Although it will really take off in the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, it's starting in the 1700s. I do humbly, therefore, offer it to public consideration, meaning perhaps maybe even a law in Parliament, that of the 120,000 children already computed, 20,000 may be reserved for breed, whereof only 1/4 part to be males, which is more than we allow to sheep, black cattle, or swine. And my reason is that these children are seldom the fruits of marriage, a circumstance not much regarded by our savages, meaning the Irish, of course. He is Anglo-Irish, and he's meaning this satirically. Therefore, one male will be sufficient to serve 4 females, that the remaining 100,000 may at a year old be offered in the sale to the persons of quality and fortune throughout the kingdom, always advising the mother to let them suck plentifully in the last month so as to render them plump and fat for a good table. A child will make 2 dishes and an entertainment for friends, and when the family dines alone, the fore or hind quarter will make a reasonable dish, and seasoned with a little salt or pepper will be very good boiled on the 4th day, especially in winter. So why am I telling you this awful tale, sharing you this awful idea of Jonathan Swift's, the satirical idea of boiling and eating children, Irish children, because they're overpopulated? Well, because reason can be used for anything, right? We can reason anything. So to what extent has the Enlightenment helped humanity? To what extent has the Enlightenment hurt humanity? To what extent has the Enlightenment divided humanity? These are all important questions, but the use of reason has both helped and both hurt and divided. And the push of the thrust of the Enlightenment being reason and overcoming religion has, as we see today with problems such as ISIS and problems with religious fervor everywhere, whether it's in America or in the Middle East, we have people embracing not reason, but irrational hatred, violence. So, we have work to do still. Okay, so so the Swift, by the way, is an important figure to know. This is a satirical work in which he's saying, hey, well, if we're so crazy about progress and about engineering society, how far could it go? Could we potentially be reasoning that we're going to boil and eat children because they're overpopulated, and especially if the Irish being looked down upon by the English, this brings in an interesting racial, meaning ethnic kind of division component where you could reason that we should boil children that are overpopulated in certain other areas, right? How many times have we referred to other people as savages? Okay, so these are ideas that I want to grapple with you guys. Okay, Voltaire, the great popularizer of the Enlightenment. Now I'm kind of reading through my notes. Influences royal courts everywhere, especially in Prussia. His mission, of course, as we said, fighting bigotry, prejudice, superstition, crushing the infamous thing, meaning Christianity. He's optimistic of man's potential. He shares this view with Joseph II of Austria, especially. As he says, the greatest prejudice of all is to not dare to attack or emancipate oneself from prejudice. And, of course, Christianity is his great source of prejudice. And he says that, he is a deist at heart and no one should have any monopoly on religion, especially the state, for sure. Remember that under absolutism, the state still has control over religion, right? Going back to the Treaty of Westphalia, right? This idea of cuius regio, eius religio is still there. So he attacked the Gallican Church in France, Catholics, Protestants, Jews with equal bitterness, and advocated for tolerance. But this becomes skewed because people pick up on the Jewish part. Judaism will suffer in the 19th century and beyond, and has already suffered by this time, by the 1700s. Voltaire inadvertently is responsible for a lot of violent anti-Semitism. Why? Because he blames Jews for Christianity, right? This myth is repeated over and over in history. The myth of the Jews killing Jesus is perpetuated by Christians. Myths of Jews taking Christian babies, right? Perpetuated by Christians. So he's reasoning. The reason why I brought up Swift is that he reasons that the Jews killed Jesus. So therefore, there would be no Christianity without the Jews. But do we see how reason begins to lead us down a false path? It was really the Romans who killed Jesus, and Jesus was a political threat on their hold on Judea, on the hold in the Roman times. So this is a historical inaccuracy. It was the Jewish power structure, actually, that was, that had been co-opted. Okay, we should read Reza Aslan's book Zealot if you want more information on that. So his condemnation of the Jewish people influenced the 19th century, which is the first unintended consequence of the Enlightenment. So even those enlightened absolutists, Frederick and Joseph, who granted tolerations to Jews, put limits on Jewish toleration. So I just wanted to show you this. This is what's called a pogrom, and I'll get back to Frederick and Joseph in a second. A pogrom is basically an uprising against Jews that a lot of them happen in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. It's something that we're going to need to know. So pogrom. So I'm just going to read you a little bit of a textbook right now. Europe's 3 million Jews in the 1700s suffered intolerance and often persecution all across Europe, especially in Eastern Europe. Jews could not hold titles of nobility, join guilds, or hold city office. In many places they could own land, although in some German states they needed special permission to buy houses. They were excluded from agricultural occupations and certain trades in France, Eastern Europe, and Russia. For example, the Habsburg monarchy required Jews to stay inside until noon on Sundays, and in 1745 it suddenly ordered the thousands of Jews living in Prague to leave. Things like that would happen all the time. They were kept in ghettos. They were kept in certain areas of cities. Then, because money lending had been one of the few professions Jews were allowed to practice, Polish, Russian, and Ukrainian Jews faced resentment from peasants who often owed them money. In Poland, the Catholic Church often led the way in persecution. Rumors that Jews were ritually sacrificing Christian children during Passover found credulous ears, meaning they believed this stuff. In 1762, Ukrainian peasants killed at least 20,000 Jews in the bloodiest pogrom of the century. Yet, by about 1750, Western Europe seemed to be entering a more tolerant age. For one thing, intolerance generated periodic rebellions, which took state funds to put down, but a more humanitarian spirit could also be felt. So let's look at this. Jews are settling in Eastern Europe. They are put down in Eastern Europe all the time, but in Western Europe, which is more of a center of the Enlightenment, it starts to get a little bit better. Okay, so back to Frederick and Joseph. Okay, here's Joseph. Here's Frederick. Right? Here's Joseph. Look at Joseph. They did grant toleration to Jews. Okay, he's in Austria, so he's technically Central/Eastern Europe. But Joseph and Frederick, the Prussians, so the Austrians and the Prussians, they grant conditional toleration only. Only Jews who had gone to state schools were tolerated. State schools, they thought, would make the Jews into honest people, said Joseph II. This would be fatal for Jews later on. They're always perceived as inherently not loyal to the state. So, we always think of the Holocaust as this kind of blip, but one of my goals in this course is to help you guys see that anti-Semitism is a long tradition in Europe. The Jews are still ghettoized, as I said. The separate culture, physically removed from others in ghettos, so they're separated. Ghetto walls lifted in France and Western Europe only after 1789, only after the French Revolution, and not until much later in Italy or Eastern Europe in the 20th century, after World War II. Jews were always made into a separate culture. So Voltaire, back to Voltaire. I want to go back to Voltaire for a second. He was no Democrat. He believed in superior and inferior intelligences. I think this is important. He said, "We are intelligent beings. Intelligent beings cannot have been formed by a crude, blind, insensible being. There is certainly some difference between the ideas of Newton and the dung of a mule. Newton's intelligence, therefore, came from another intelligence." His caveat was only if you only have superior intelligence, if you are freed from prejudice, right? So you had to be freed from prejudice in order to have superior intelligence. So like the humanists of the Renaissance, he is elitist. There's no equality yet with Voltaire. He's a fan of enlightened absolutism, but an absolutist nonetheless. So he's not a Democrat. If everyone becomes a Newton, right, if everybody was as smart as Newton, maybe there can be inequality. So therefore he champions education. But because of this existence of superior and inferior intelligences, monarchy was necessary, but a special type. Of course, he champions enlightened despotism / absolutism, and Frederick the Great was his friend and confidant, and he stayed at his court from 1750 to 1753. If you go back and read Candide, you can kind of see which is written in 1759. He portrays the Bulgarians, meaning the Germans, meaning the Prussians, in a slightly negative light. So Voltaire, a fan of monarchy, but it must be the right type, meaning enlightened despotism. So therefore, he says no divine right of kings. Right, he rejects the divine right. says that war against superstition must be necessary because the common people will always be full of superstition. He says, as long as there are fools and rascals, there will always be religion. This is why Frederick the Great is considered the first real enlightened despot. He rejects divine right. Frederick the Great does. Frederick the Great, let's go back to him. Frederick the Great rejects divine right. He wrote philosophy himself, played the flute, held salons, provided limited religious toleration, founded a scientific academy. He said a monarch must provide an example of enlightenment, right? Joseph II, too, furthered education, freed the serfs, furthered toleration, at least a little bit, lifted some censorship, although he did also have a secret police force, so we have to always kind of say, to what extent are these enlightened, absolutists enlightened? He had lots of informants and spies and this extensive police state, so yeah. So to summarize Voltaire, okay, back to Voltaire. He's fundamentally destructive to Christianity. He attacks baptism as murder washed away by water, which he thinks is a laughable concept. So it's a radical break from Christianity, a break from divine right, and allows the tradition from divine right monarchy to enlightened absolutism. So he wants changes in attitudes that from the past, but not changes in economic or social orders. Okay, so he's politically radical, but not necessarily economically or socially. Much like Montesquieu, okay? But Montesquieu was conservative, and Rousseau as well denies economic equality. He's way less elitist, though, than Voltaire. So let's now talk about the Enlightenment in general. There's Catherine the Great. We're going to talk about her in a second. Actually, let's talk about her now because I wanted to kind of say Voltaire, corresponded with her. She was trying to be absolutist, and kind of to what extent was she succeeding in being absolutist? We can say, well, she did. She came to power, ruled for 34 years. This is kind of like in the 1760s to 1790s. She instituted lots of Enlightenment-style reforms at first, right? She codified laws, restricted the use of torture, which is interesting, which brings me to this guy, Cesare Beccaria. Okay, so Beccaria is an important figure, one that influenced the Enlightened despots greatly. Okay, he wrote on Crimes and Punishment in 1764. He had read Montesquieu and Rousseau, Diderot, and applied their analysis to the issues at hand, meaning he argued that the state's task was to protect society while respecting the dignity of all people. This meant that the rights of those accused of crimes, too, had to be protected. So his assumption that the accused is innocent until proven guilty has remained, along with the tradition of English constitutional law and trial by jury, a cornerstone of Western judicial systems. Okay, so this is where we get the idea that, hey, prisoners have rights too, and that people should be treated with dignity when they're captured. Beccaria argued that the punishment for a given crime, here's the other thing, the punishment for a given crime should not be linked to the religious concept of sin, but rather rationally determined by an assessment of the damage done to society. He argued that it is better to prevent crimes than to punish them, and his principles reflected the origins of something called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, which is the influential social theory of the first decades of the 19th century that held that laws should be judged by their social utility, meaning a law is only as good as the number of people that it helps. So if a law only helps like 1% of the people, then it's not really that great. If a law helps 90% of the people, then it's awesome. Okay, so that's utilitarianism. We will go into that soon. There's Wesley, an inadvertent agent of democracy, I say. We're going to get to him in a second. Okay, so back to the ideas of the philosophes. We'll just kind of go back to Voltaire here. All right, so these characteristics of the philosophes. Okay, I'm just going to rattle them off. Deism, God is the watchmaker. Natural laws, science, overall human goodness, reason, progress, rationality, optimism, reform of society, the perfectibility of man, human potential, tolerance, skepticism, doubt, critique. But in reality, the philosophes are not dogmatic. This is not a strict doctrine. Philosophes knew man's weaknesses and strengths. They did not assert that reason is the sole criterion for man's actions, but they emphasized that in order to get to a society in which reason dominates, you must question everything, right? But questioning everything gives elbow room to the everyman. It allows for freedom and individuality. So, meaning if we employ reason, then we have to consider the idea that the common man is worth something. We must cultivate our own garden, as he says in Candide, okay? We must cultivate reason, discover natural laws that connect us all, but not until Rousseau is this explicitly expressed. Voltaire only does it in fable, like in Candide, okay? Rousseau comes out and says it. But pragmatism is an ism that is key to the Enlightenment. They wanted practical solutions, right? Like, for example, the partition of Poland, okay, could be seen as practical. Or the codification of laws is seen as practical. The reduction of the use of torture as a means to get truth out of, right? Because Beccaria thinks that torture should not be used either. The idea of the use of torture as getting people truth, no. If you torture someone, then they're just going to tell you anything you want to hear, and it might not be the truth. They wanted practical solutions. They wanted to make systems more efficient. They rejected inherited truth, right? A priori knowledge. So the philosophes, they're still dependent on the system. They're dependent on the enlightened despots, especially Voltaire. And if those leaders had deserted them, they would be sunk. But they wanted practical solutions. But beware of the coming backlash to all this, okay, or the undercurrent, okay, and this is where we get to Wesley. Obviously, Romanticism in the 19th century is going to champion feeling over reason, and these religious revivals, Wesley and Whitefield, like the Great Awakening, right? This Wesley says a new birth. Ye must be born again, right? Through feeling, an emotional coming to Christ. This is evidence that people are still thirsting for myths and symbols. Okay, this is what I want to make sure you understand: myths and symbols. Myths and symbols are being eroded by the secularization of the world. What do I mean by that? Myths and symbols are being eroded by secularization, meaning that as Christianity declines and the established churches declines, right, people are grappling with not having these stories and these symbols to kind of bring meaning to their life, these cultural elements. So to the philosophes, these myths and rituals and symbols were superstitions, right? They didn't like these myths or rituals or symbols. They had no patience for them. They could only provide esoteric feelings. Myths, rituals, symbols were irrational. But the masses, as we know, flocked to the evangelical revival. Even Robespierre, the reign of terror guy from the French Revolution, which you guys are going to be reading about, found that the people needed myths and symbols. We will see. He establishes this goddess of reason from the French Revolution, Marianne. Like he kind of says, "Oh my God, like people need something to get behind." And what we see is that there are no successful mass movements without myths and symbols. Okay, we're gonna see this, and sometimes symbols can appear spontaneously. In the French Revolution, you're gonna read about the sans-culotte, like the ultra radical, the radical revolutionaries that wear certain types of pants. Right, sometimes symbols can be clothing, sometimes symbols can be religious, sometimes not. Okay, so this religious revival gave people security, because it was like, oh, okay, well, God isn't abandoning us yet. It also rejected traditional theology. It was an emotional coming to Christ, so it was not affiliated with the church. It was evangelicalism. The myth and the symbol was Christ only. So it rejected other myths and symbols of the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church. So this is another foundation of Romanticism, right? This feeling, this being born again. Religious revival was also helped by Enlightenment education and all those pamphlets and books that are being published. So they are, it's emotionalism through literature and mass meetings, and Rousseau is going to capture some of this idea of emotionalism. And the mass meeting, what you see here, the mass meeting is so important, okay? To have a ritual and a festival, right? The ritual of coming to hear someone speak and the festival surrounding it, because they wouldn't just hear him speak. They would like have music, and they would have dancing, and they not necessarily dancing, but they would have food, and it would be a whole thing. It would be a whole festival. Remember all those festivals by the Catholic Church that are kind of disappearing slowly because people have to work more, and people aren't getting those same days off that they were in the 1600s when the Catholic Church was dominant, and before. Because of the Reformation, okay? So ultimately, it can be argued that the united front of religion and Romanticism against the Enlightenment will be victorious in the 19th century, okay? It proves stronger than the critical mind in the end, right? So going back to our essential questions: to what extent has the Enlightenment helped humanity or hurt humanity or divided humanity? We can argue, and many historians have argued, that religion and Romanticism against the Enlightenment have been victorious in the 19th and 20th centuries and beyond, and stronger than the critical mind in the end. You don't have to look much further than ISIS to see this. There is conflict here, what we call a dialectic. Okay, a dialectic. Let's look that up. Okay, dialectic. Let's see if dialectic. The art of investigating or discussing the truth of opinions, right, relating to a dialectical debate. Okay, there's a dialectic, a conflict, and we're going to have this word pop up again and again. There's a dialectic, a conflict between the Enlightenment and evangelicalism, and it continues in the bourgeoisie, in the middle classes, in the noble classes in the 19th century. In the Romantic movement, it is the masses that are captured by this feeling. Okay, so to what extent has the Enlightenment really trickled down to everyday people? A summary of the Enlightenment overall. I'm almost done with this part of the flipped lecture. Okay, and then we're going to get to Rousseau. A summary of the Enlightenment. Okay, it's universalist, not nationalistic. Everyone could have enlightenment regardless of birth. I think that's very important. French culture proliferates. Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great, all courts speak French. Romanticism will be a reaction against French culture. We will read that German nationalism will be very romantic, and will pick up on the idea that we are reacting against the infiltration of French culture. Guys like Fichte and Hegel and Herder, names that you'll hear later. The practical results: it produces men of goodwill. They want to help humankind progress. So this can be called humanitarianism. There will be social reform in the 19th century because of the Enlightenment. The ideas of social welfare, right? The Enlightenment will instill the idea that states need to help relieve suffering during the Industrial Revolution, the idea that we need to spread tolerance for all human beings, the rise of the belief that all human life has value, that people should be cared for. It also produces the essences of liberalism, the ideas of limited government, human rights, equality, the rule of law, individualism, self-determination, freedom of speech, religion, movement, all these rights that we have in the USA. Really, if we think about it, the USA is the first post-Enlightenment country. The Enlightenment emancipates minorities to a certain extent, like Jews, for the first time, really. Serfdom disappears mostly, except in Russia, of course. Codification of the law leads to the destruction of localism, the remnants of feudalism, and noble privilege, right? Going back to Catherine the Great here. Equality before the law. She starts by abolishing legal and feudal privileges, but then later on, of course, because of Pugachev's rebellion, she has to go back on this. She has to kind of she has to be increasingly repressive of peasants and serfs, and the landlords get a lot of their power back, right? So these ideas of the Enlightenment are contingent on other things happening. Also, the Enlightenment supports the French and American revolutions. Okay, to what extent does it cause the French Revolution? That's going to be we're going to have to debate that. Does the Enlightenment lead to an eventual disintegration of absolutism itself? I would agree. I would argue yes. Does this lead to eventual disintegration of mercantilism? I would say yes, with Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations. So liberalism begins, which argues for steady progress. But there will be a reaction to that, a dialectical conflict, meaning conservatism, the idea of clinging to traditional ways. So soon we will see radicals and reactionaries, right? Meaning liberals and conservatives on either side of the spectrum. So even if it fell short, let's look at the Enlightenment. Even if it fell short, the Enlightenment still provides hope. What could humans take away from these writers and leaders, at least with the educated bourgeoisie? That some very important things. The judgment of a man is by the standard of his behavior and the quality of his intellect, not by his religion. In the end, the surest guarantee for progress is freedom, freedom under natural law, the allowing of the freedom for the critical mind, freedom including economic freedom, is the guarantor of progress. The idea of universalism, that no man, once he is enlightened, must lord it over another, no divine appointment to authority, only authority lies with intellectual ability, but we must pity those whose minds remain unfree or unenlightened. Practical applications. The intellectual must try to reform society. The intellectual must take action. We've got to reform with reason in mind to make the world more efficient, but it's not pro-revolution. Revolution is not efficient. Violent revolution is not rational. So we have to move through reform, okay? That's the big difference with the philosophes. They're not revolutionaries. They are rational.